The wheel cracked with a sound like a snapping bone, and Clara Bennett felt the entire cart tilt beneath her feet. Jars of honey slid across the wooden bed and shattered against the low rail, gold liquid pouring out onto the muddy road. She grabbed the seat with both hands, her knuckles turning white, and for one terrible second, she thought the whole cart would roll into the ditch beside her, dragging the old horse down with it. "Whoa! Whoa, Daisy! Whoa!" she shouted, pulling hard on the reins. The horse reared, eyes wide with fright, and the cart lurched sideways before finally settling with a groan into the mud. Rain hammered down around her, cold and relentless, soaking through her shawl and plastering her hair to her face. Thunder rolled somewhere behind the black line of trees, close enough that she felt it in her chest. She sat there for a moment, breathing hard, staring at the broken wheel, lying half buried in the mud, like the leg of some fallen animal. This was Timber Pass, the loneliest stretch of road between Millbrook Hollow and the market towns to the east. No houses, no lanterns, no other travelers foolish enough to be out in a storm like this one. Clara pressed a hand to her chest and tried to steady her breathing. She was 26 years old, a widow for nearly 2 years now, and she had learned, in that time, not to panic. Panic did not fix broken wheels. Panic did not put food on the table. Only work did that, and so she forced herself to climb down from the seat, her boots sinking into the cold mud, and she walked around to look at the damage. The wheel was beyond repair, not cracked, shattered. The wood splintered into long, jagged pieces that curled outward like the petals of some broken flower. There would be no fixing this tonight. There would be no fixing this at all without a wheelwright, and the nearest wheelwright was a full day's walk in either direction. She was stranded. The realization settled into her stomach like a stone dropped into still water. Night was coming fast, the gray light already fading behind the storm clouds, and she was alone on a forest road with a broken cart, a frightened horse, and nothing but the honey business her late husband had left behind to keep her fed. If she lost this cart, if she lost this horse, she would lose everything. "Think, Clara," she whispered to herself, wiping rain from her eyes. "Think." She could not leave the cart. What honey remained inside the unbroken jars was worth more than she cared to admit, and if she abandoned it here, there would be nothing left by morning. Thieves, animals, or simply the storm itself would see to that. But she could not simply sit here either, not with the temperature dropping and her clothes already soaked through. Daisy stamped nervously in her harness, ears flat against her skull, nostrils flaring at something in the trees. Clara turned to look in the direction the horse was staring, but she saw nothing except shadows and rain, and the black shapes of pine trees swaying in the wind. "It's all right," she murmured, moving to stroke the horse's neck, though she was not entirely sure she believed the words herself. "It's all right, girl, we'll figure something out." She began unhitching Daisy from the broken cart, her fingers clumsy and slow with cold. The leather straps were slick with rain, and twice she nearly dropped the buckle into the mud. When at last the horse was free, Clara looped the lead rope around a nearby tree, giving her enough room to move but not enough to bolt into the darkness. Then she turned back to the cart and began gathering what she could carry, the unbroken jars of honey, wrapped in cloth, tucked into a satchel she slung over one shoulder. It was while she was crouched beside the wreckage, arms full of honey jars, that she first heard the sound. A soft whimper, close, somewhere in the brush just off the road. Clara froze, honey jars pressed against her chest, and listened. The rain made it hard to hear anything clearly, but there it was again, a small, high-pitched cry, almost like a puppy. She should have ignored it. Every instinct told her to climb back onto what remained of the cart, wrap herself in whatever dry cloth she could find, and wait out the night as best she could. But something about that sound, so small and so frightened, tugged at something inside her that she could not quite name. She set the honey jars down carefully and crept toward the tree line, peering into the shadows. 3 pairs of eyes stared back at her, glowing faintly gold in what little light remained. Clara's breath caught in her throat. For one heart-stopping moment she thought she was looking at foxes, or perhaps large dogs that had wandered from some distant farm. But as her eyes adjusted to the gloom, she realized with a jolt of understanding exactly what she was looking at. Wolf pups. 3 of them, huddled together beneath the low branches of a fallen tree, soaked through and shivering, their small bodies pressed together for warmth. One of them, the smallest, with a patch of darker fur across its back, was the one making the crying sound, its little body trembling with each breath. Clara's first instinct was fear. She had heard the stories, as everyone in Millbrook Hollow had, of wolves in these woods, of livestock lost, and travelers who claimed to have seen shapes moving between the trees at night. But these were not fearsome creatures. These were babies, no bigger than house cats, lost and frightened in a storm that was far too big for them. "Where is your mother?" she whispered, though she knew they could not answer her. She should walk away. She knew that. A grown wolf, somewhere nearby, would not take kindly to a human standing this close to its young, and every story she had ever heard about protective parents ended badly for the fool who got too close. But she looked at the smallest pup, still crying, still shivering, and she could not make herself turn around. Slowly, carefully, she reached into her satchel and pulled out one of the honey jars, twisting off the cloth wrapping. She dipped 2 fingers into the golden liquid and held her hand out, low and steady, the way she might approach a nervous horse. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said softly. "I promise." The pups did not move at first. Then the boldest of the 3, a slightly larger pup with a paler coat, crept forward on unsteady legs, nose twitching, drawn by the sweet smell. It sniffed her fingers cautiously, then, to Clara's astonishment, gave them a tentative lick. She almost laughed despite everything, despite the broken cart, the freezing rain, the very real risk she might be putting herself in. There was something so purely innocent about the moment that it cut straight through her fear. One by one, the other 2 pups crept closer, drawn by the smell of honey and, perhaps, by the warmth of her presence. Clara knelt in the mud, heedless now of her already ruined dress, and let them nose at her hands, at her fingers, small tongues lapping at the sweetness she offered. It was only then that she noticed something else, something that sent a fresh wave of alarm through her chest. A shape, far larger than any of the pups, standing perfectly still at the edge of the tree line. Clara's whole body went rigid. She did not need to see it clearly to know what it was. The size alone told her everything. Easily as tall as her waist at the shoulder, with a chest broad enough to be mistaken for a small bear in the dim light. Its eyes caught what little light remained, 2 points of pale gold fixed directly on her. The father, or perhaps the mother, she could not tell, and it did not matter in that moment. What mattered was that a fully grown wolf, easily strong enough to overpower her without effort, was watching her kneel in the mud beside its young, feeding them from her own hands. Every instinct told her to run, but something about the way the great wolf stood there gave her pause. It was not lunging, it was not baring its teeth or lowering its head in the posture of an animal ready to strike. It simply stood, watching, its massive head tilted slightly, as it observed the strange scene before it. A lone woman, soaked and shivering, offering warmth and sweetness to 3 pups who did not belong to her. Clara held perfectly still, honey-covered fingers extended, heart hammering so loudly she was certain the wolf could hear it. "I mean them no harm," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper, carried away almost instantly by the wind and rain. "I mean you no harm either." The wolf did not move, it did not blink. For what felt like an eternity, the 2 of them simply stared at one another across the clearing, while 3 small pups continued licking honey from Clara's fingers, utterly unaware of the tension hanging in the air above their heads. Then, slowly, the great wolf lowered itself to sit, its haunches settling into the wet grass, its gaze never leaving her. It was not a threat. It was, Clara realized, with something between relief and disbelief, a kind of patience. The wolf was waiting to see what she would do next. Clara let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. She looked back down at the pups, now nuzzling against her knees, seeking out more of the warmth and sweetness she offered, and made a decision that she would later come to see as the turning point of her entire life. She was not going to leave them here in the storm, not the pups, and though the thought unsettled her, not entirely willing to leave under the watchful eye of their enormous parent either. "All right," she murmured, more to herself than to the animals surrounding her. "All right, let's get out of this rain, at least for tonight." She gathered the small bundle of cloth she had used to wrap the honey jars and spread it beneath the low branches where the pups had been sheltering, creating a slightly drier space for them to huddle. She sat down beside them, drawing her knees up, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold, and glanced once more toward the tree line where the great wolf remained seated, motionless, watching. The storm raged on around them, thunder rolling across the sky, rain hissing through the leaves overhead. Somewhere behind her, Daisy shifted nervously against her rope, and the wreckage of the honey cart sat abandoned in the mud, gold liquid still leaking slowly from its broken jars. Clara Bennett, widow, honey merchant, and now, it seemed, an unlikely guardian to 3 lost wolf pups, sat shivering beneath a fallen tree in the heart of Timber Pass, and waited to see what the night would bring. She did not sleep. She could not have, even if exhaustion had allowed it, not with 3 warm little bodies pressed against her legs, and a pair of golden eyes watching from the darkness beyond. But somewhere in the long hours before dawn, as the storm slowly softened into a gentle drizzle, and then finally into stillness, Clara found herself thinking not of fear, but of something else entirely. She thought of her husband, gone 2 years now, and the honey cart he had left behind. She thought of the empty cottage she returned to each night, its silence pressing in on her like a physical weight. She thought of how long it had been since anything, anyone, had needed her, truly needed her, the way these small, trembling creatures needed her now. And when the first gray light of morning finally began to filter through the branches overhead, Clara looked down to find all 3 pups fast asleep against her, their small chests rising and falling in peaceful rhythm, and looked up to find the great wolf still there, still watching, though something in its posture had shifted overnight. The tension was gone. What remained looked, strangely, almost like understanding. Clara did not know what the coming days would bring. She did not know that this single night, born from a broken wheel and a storm she never wanted, would set into motion a chain of events that would change not only her life, but the lives of everyone in Millbrook Hollow. She did not know about the suspicion and worry she would soon face from her own neighbors, or about the unexpected kindness that would find her in the most unlikely of places. All she knew, in that quiet moment as dawn broke over Timber Pass, was that she was no longer entirely alone. And for the first time in 2 long years, that thought brought her something she had almost forgotten the feeling of: hope. She reached out a careful hand and rested it gently on the smallest pup's damp fur, feeling its tiny heartbeat flutter beneath her palm, and allowed herself, just for a moment, to believe that perhaps some good could come from even the worst of storms. In the tree line, the great wolf rose to its feet, stretched once, and let out a low, quiet sound that was neither growl nor howl, but something in between. A sound Clara would come to recognize, in time, as a kind of greeting. The sun was rising, the storm had passed. Somewhere far down the road, a farmer's cart creaked along on its morning route, its driver humming a tune, entirely unaware of the strange and gentle scene unfolding just beyond the trees. And nothing in Clara Bennett's life would ever be quite the same again. She thought about her late husband, Edmund, and how he used to say that the forest gave back what you put into it. Kindness for kindness, patience for patience. She had thought it was simply something he said to comfort her on hard days when the honey did not sell, or when the bees seemed restless and would not settle. Now, kneeling in the mud with 3 wolf pups curled against her, and their father watching from a distance, she wondered if perhaps he had meant it more literally than she had ever understood. The smallest pup stirred and opened one eye, looking up at her with an expression so trusting that it made her chest ache. She smiled down at it, the first real smile she had allowed herself in longer than she could remember, and gently stroked the top of its small, damp head. "We will figure this out together," she told it, and though the pup could not possibly have understood her words, it seemed, for a moment, to settle more deeply into the warmth of her side, as though it had. The road ahead was still broken. The cart still lay in ruins behind her. But as the morning light spread slowly across Timber Pass, chasing away the last shadows of the storm, Clara Bennett found herself, for the first time in 2 long years, looking toward the future, instead of merely surviving the present. Whatever came next, she would not be facing it entirely alone. Millbrook Hollow was a small village, the kind of place where every face was familiar, and every piece of gossip traveled faster than any horse could carry it. Clara had grown up there, had married there, had buried her husband in the small graveyard behind the chapel there, and had never once imagined leaving. The honey trade had been Edmund's idea long before it became hers. He had kept a dozen hives behind their small cottage, tending them with a patience she had always admired, speaking to the bees the way other men spoke to their dogs or their horses. When the fever took him 2 winters ago, Clara had inherited not only his hives but his customers, his routes, and his quiet reputation for honesty, in a trade where many merchants were known to water down their goods or sell honey, mixed with cheaper syrups. She had never wanted to run a honey cart alone. She had wanted, more than anything, the life she and Edmund had planned together, children running through the garden, evenings spent by the fire, growing old side by side. Instead, she had spent 2 winters learning how to harness a horse by herself, how to haggle with buyers who assumed a widow could be easily cheated, how to mend her own boots and patch her own roof when the rains came through. She had become, without quite meaning to, a woman the village both respected and slightly feared, too capable to be pitied, too alone to be entirely understood. It was this same quiet loneliness that had sent her out on the road that morning, storm clouds already gathering on the horizon, because a family 2 villages over had ordered honey for a wedding feast, and she could not afford to disappoint a paying customer, not with winter coming, and her savings thinner than she liked to admit. She had told herself the storm would hold off until she reached shelter. She had been wrong, and that mistake had cost her a wheel, a night in the mud, and, as it now seemed, an encounter that would reshape the entire course of her life. She looked down again, at the 3 pups sleeping against her side, and found herself smiling, despite the ache in her back, and the cold, still clinging to her damp clothes. There was something almost absurd about the situation, a woman known throughout Millbrook Hollow for her steady, practical nature, sitting in the mud at dawn, cradling wild animals as though they were her own children. If anyone from the village could see her now, they would think she had lost her senses entirely. And yet she could not bring herself to regret it. The largest pup, the pale one who had been the first to taste honey from her fingers, stirred, and let out a wide yawn before clambering unsteadily onto her lap, as though it belonged there, as though this strange arrangement between wolf and woman were the most natural thing in the world. Clara laughed softly, surprising herself with the sound, and scratched gently behind its ears. "You are a bold little thing," she murmured, "braver than your brothers, it seems." As if in response, the smallest pup lifted its head and let out a small, indignant sound, prompting another laugh from Clara. For a moment, sitting there in the growing light with 3 wolf pups around her, she forgot entirely about the broken cart, the ruined honey, the long walk that likely awaited her, and simply allowed herself to feel something she had not felt in longer than she could remember. Not sorrow. Not the dull ache of loss she had carried for 2 years. Something lighter. Something that, if she had let herself name it, she might have called joy. She glanced once more toward the tree line, where the great wolf remained seated, patient and unmoving, its golden eyes fixed on the small tableau before it. There was no mistaking the intelligence in that gaze, nor the careful restraint the animal was showing, a creature capable of such violence, choosing instead to wait, to watch, to allow a stranger to comfort its young, rather than driving her away, or worse. Clara found herself wondering, not for the last time, what kind of creature this truly was, and what kind of story had led it here, alone with 3 pups and no mate in sight. She would not learn the answer that morning. But as Daisy whinnied softly behind her, growing restless in her makeshift tether, and as the first true rays of sunlight broke fully over the tops of the pine trees, Clara Bennett rose slowly to her feet, gathered her satchel of remaining honey jars, and began to consider, with the same practical mind that had carried her through 2 long winters alone, exactly what she was going to do next. Walking away was no longer something she could imagine. Whatever waited for her beyond Timber Pass, whatever the village would say when she returned with a story no one would believe, Clara understood, with a certainty that surprised her, that some threads, once crossed, could never again be pulled apart. The storm had broken her cart. It had also, it seemed, broken something open inside her, that she had thought long sealed shut. And as she took her first careful step toward the fallen tree, toward the pups now watching her with wide, curious eyes, she felt, for the first time in 2 years, that she was walking toward something, rather than merely away from her grief. Clara knew she could not carry 3 wolf pups and a satchel of honey jars all the way to Millbrook Hollow on foot, not with Daisy still trembling from the storm, and the road ahead littered with fallen branches and deep pools of standing water. She needed a plan, something practical, something that would not leave her stranded a second time. She thought of Old Man Ferris, who lived closest to Timber Pass, a retired blacksmith who kept mostly to himself, but had never once turned away a neighbor in need. It was nearly 2 miles to his cottage, a distance that felt far greater with her boots soaked through, and her arms already aching from a night spent sitting upright against a fallen tree. But there was no other choice. She gathered the last of the unbroken honey jars into her satchel, checked that Daisy's tether was secure enough to hold until she returned, and turned to look one final time at the 3 pups watching her from beneath the low branches. "I will come back for you," she said softly, though even as she spoke the words, she wondered if she had any right to make such a promise to creatures that were not hers to keep. The pale pup whimpered and took a hesitant step toward her, and behind it, still seated at the edge of the clearing, the great wolf lifted its head slightly, watching her with an intensity that made her chest tighten. She did not know what instinct guided her next action, only that it felt right in a way she could not fully explain. She knelt once more, dipped her fingers into the last of the open honey jar, and offered it to the pale pup, letting it lick clean what remained. "Stay close to your father," she told it gently. "I will not be long." Then she rose, shouldered her satchel, and began the long walk toward Old Man Ferris's cottage, leaving the pups and their silent guardian behind her in the slowly brightening woods. The walk felt endless. Her legs, stiff from the cold and the long night, protested every step, and more than once she had to stop and catch her breath against the trunk of a tree, listening to the drip of rainwater falling from branches overhead. She thought of nothing but putting one foot in front of the other, of reaching the cottage, of finding some way to fix the broken cart and return for the pups before nightfall. When at last she caught sight of gray smoke curling up from a stone chimney through the trees, relief flooded through her so completely that she nearly wept. Old Man Ferris answered her knock still in his nightclothes, a heavy blanket wrapped around his shoulders, his gray hair standing in every direction. His expression shifted quickly from confusion to concern as he took in her mud-stained dress and exhausted face. "Good heavens, child, what happened to you?" "My cartwheel broke on Timber Pass," Clara explained, her voice hoarse from disuse. "I need help, if you can spare it. A new wheel, or a way to move what remains of my goods." Ferris did not hesitate. Within the hour he had hitched his own cart, gathered a spare wheel from his workshop that he thought might fit with some adjustment, and set off with Clara back toward the wreckage on Timber Pass. She said nothing to him about the pups, uncertain how he might react, uncertain even how to explain the strange peace that had settled over her during that long, cold night in the mud. When they arrived, Daisy was exactly where Clara had left her, still tethered to the tree, calmer now in the daylight but clearly eager to be free of the rope. Ferris set to work at once, examining the broken wheel with the practiced eye of a man who had spent his life working with wood and iron, muttering to himself about angles and axles as he began the slow process of repair. Clara used the time to slip away toward the fallen tree where she had left the pups, her heart pounding with a strange mixture of hope and fear that they might already be gone, that the whole encounter might have been some trick of exhaustion and fading light. But there they were, exactly as she had left them, huddled together beneath the branches, and there too, standing a short distance away, was their father, watching with the same patient, unblinking gaze he had shown throughout the night. "I have not forgotten you," she murmured, kneeling once more to stroke each small head in turn. She heard Ferris calling her name from the road, and rose reluctantly, casting one last glance toward the pups, before hurrying back to help with the cart. It took the better part of the morning to fit the new wheel properly, and by the time the work was finished, the sun had climbed well past midday, casting long shadows through the trees. "You should get that cart home and rest," Ferris told her, wiping grease from his hands onto an old rag. "You look like you have not slept in a week." "I appreciate everything you have done," Clara said, and meant it fully. "I do not know how I would have managed without you." Ferris waved off her thanks with a gruff shake of his head, climbed back into his own cart, and set off toward his cottage, leaving Clara alone once more on the now repaired road. She stood beside her cart for a long moment, staring toward the tree line where she knew the pups were still waiting, and made a decision that she suspected would change everything that came after. She could not simply leave them there, not after everything, not when she had already promised, however foolishly, that she would return. Clara walked back to the fallen tree and knelt one final time before the three pups, studying each of their small faces as though trying to memorize every detail. The pale one, bold and curious, who had been first to trust her, the smallest, with its dark patch of fur, still prone to soft, frightened cries, and the third, quieter than its siblings, content simply to watch and observe rather than approach. "Would you like to come with me?" she asked them softly, feeling faintly ridiculous even as she spoke the words aloud to creatures that could not possibly understand her question. "I cannot promise you an easy life. I can only promise that I will care for you as best I know how." She glanced up toward the great wolf, still watching from its usual place at the edge of the clearing, and found herself addressing it as well, her voice steady, despite the strange nature of the moment. "I will look after them," she said. "You have my word." The wolf did not move, did not make a sound, but something in its posture seemed to soften, its head lowering slightly in a gesture that Clara chose, in that moment, to interpret as acceptance. Perhaps it was foolish to read such meaning into the behavior of a wild animal. Perhaps she was simply exhausted and grasping at comfort wherever she could find it, but she believed, with a certainty she could not fully justify, that the great wolf understood exactly what she was offering, and had chosen, for reasons known only to itself, to allow it. Gently, carefully, she gathered the three pups into the folds of her shawl, cradling them against her chest, as she rose to her feet and made her way back toward the waiting cart. They did not struggle or cry out, seeming almost to sense that this was not a moment for fear, but for trust. Daisy shifted nervously as Clara approached, clearly uneasy about the small, unfamiliar creatures now nestled in her owner's arms, but years of gentle handling had built a foundation of calm between horse and driver that held even now. Clara settled the pups carefully into a woven basket she kept beneath the driver's seat, lining it with a spare cloth to soften the ride, and climbed up beside them, gathering the reins in her still cold hands. Before she urged Daisy forward, she looked back one final time toward the tree line. The great wolf remained there, motionless, watching as the cart began to roll slowly down the muddy road. Clara half expected it to follow, or perhaps to call out in protest, but it did neither. It simply watched, golden eyes tracking the cart's slow progress, until at last the trees closed in around the bend, and it disappeared from view entirely. The journey back to Millbrook Hollow felt different from any journey Clara had made before. The three pups slept soundly in their basket, exhausted from the long, cold night, occasionally stirring to nose at the edges of the cloth or press against one another for warmth. Clara found herself glancing down at them every few minutes, still hardly able to believe the turn her simple honey delivery had taken. She knew, even as the familiar rooftops of the village came into view ahead, that she would need to think carefully about how to explain their presence. Millbrook Hollow was not a place accustomed to strangeness, and three wolf pups riding openly in the back of a honey cart would draw attention she was not certain she wanted, at least not yet, not until she had some plan for how to care for them properly. She decided, as the cart rolled past the first scattered cottages at the edge of the village, that she would keep them hidden for now, tucked safely away in the small barn behind her own cottage, where Edmund had once kept his beehives. It was not a perfect solution, but it would give her time. Time to think, time to prepare, time to decide what kind of future she was building for herself, and for the three small lives now resting so trustingly in her care. As she guided Daisy down the familiar lane toward her cottage, nodding politely to a neighbor who called out a greeting from her garden, Clara felt a curious mixture of exhaustion and anticipation settle over her. Whatever waited ahead, whatever challenges her decision would bring, she knew there was no turning back now. The pups were hers to protect, at least for as long as they needed her, and somewhere back in the woods of Timber Pass, their father remained, a silent witness to a promise that had already begun to reshape the quiet, careful life she had built for herself since Edmund's passing. She pulled the cart to a stop behind her cottage, glanced around to be certain no one was watching, and carefully lifted the basket down, carrying it quickly toward the small barn at the edge of her property. The pups stirred as she set the basket down among the old, unused hive boxes, blinking sleepily up at her in the dim afternoon light filtering through the wooden slats. "This will be your home for now," she told them softly, arranging a bed of clean straw around the basket. "I promise you will be safe here." She stayed with them a while longer, watching as they settled into their new surroundings, before finally forcing herself to rise and attend to the neglected chores that awaited her. There was Daisy to unhitch and feed, the damaged remains of her honey stock to assess, and a full night's worth of exhaustion finally beginning to catch up with her. But even as she moved through the familiar rhythms of her evening routine, her mind remained fixed on the small barn behind her cottage, and on the great wolf still waiting somewhere in the woods of Timber Pass, wondering, perhaps, when or if she would ever see him again. The first week passed quietly enough that Clara almost allowed herself to believe she had found a solution that would last. She fed the pups scraps of meat traded from the butcher, softened with warm broth, and watched with quiet wonder as they grew stronger each day, their unsteady legs gaining confidence, their small voices growing bolder. She named them, though she told herself it did not truly matter, since they would not remain with her forever. The bold, pale one she called Birch, for the way his fur caught the light like the bark of the trees near her cottage. The smallest, still prone to soft cries when startled, she named Wren, and the quiet, watchful one, content to observe before acting, she called Ash. It was Birch who first slipped free of the barn. Clara discovered the gap in the old wooden slats on the fourth morning, a narrow space near the base of the wall that had rotted through years ago and never been repaired, since Edmund's bees had never needed to escape through anything so small. Birch, curious and increasingly confident, had apparently found the opening sometime in the night and wandered out into the wider world of her small garden. She found him near the vegetable beds, nose buried in a patch of overturned soil, utterly delighted with his discovery. Relief flooded through her, quickly followed by alarm at how easily he had escaped, and how easily he might be seen by a passing neighbor. She scooped him up gently, scolding him in a voice too soft to carry any real weight, and carried him back to the barn, resolving to repair the gap before nightfall. But the incident planted a seed of worry that would not leave her. The pups were growing quickly, far more quickly than she had anticipated, and with growth came curiosity, and with curiosity came risk. She could not keep 3 wolf pups hidden in a small barn indefinitely, not in a village where everyone noticed everything, where a delayed delivery or an unusual sound carried through the evening air was enough to spark a full week of speculation among the neighbors. She decided after much deliberation that secrecy alone was not a sustainable plan. She would need to begin, slowly and carefully, introducing the idea of the pups to at least a few trusted people, starting with those least likely to react with fear or hostility. Her first attempt was with Old Man Ferris, the same neighbor who had helped repair her cart. She invited him to see them under the guise of thanking him properly for his assistance, watching nervously as he crouched down beside the basket in her barn, studying the 3 pups with the same careful attention he might give to a piece of damaged machinery. "Wolves," he said finally. Not a question, but a statement of simple fact. "Yes," Clara admitted, bracing herself for a lecture about danger, about foolishness, about the risks she was taking with her own safety and the safety of the village. Instead, Ferris merely grunted and reached out a weathered hand to scratch gently behind Wren's ears, drawing a small, contented sound from the pup. "My father used to say a wolf that trusts a human is rarer than gold," he said. "Rarer still is a human willing to earn that trust in the first place." "You are not concerned?" Clara asked, genuinely surprised. "I am concerned about many things," Ferris replied, rising slowly to his feet with a soft groan. "Whether these creatures grow into something the village cannot accept is chief among them. But concern is not the same as certainty they will bring harm. Time will tell which fear proves true." His measured response gave Clara more comfort than she had expected, though it did little to quiet the deeper worry that had begun to settle in her chest, the growing awareness that she could not control how the rest of Millbrook Hollow might react once the truth became known. That truth arrived sooner than she had hoped. It was nearly 2 weeks after the storm, when young Peter Ashford, no older than 10, and known throughout the village for his habit of wandering into places he had no business exploring, spotted Birch through a gap in Clara's garden fence during one of his frequent expeditions. The boy ran home immediately, breathless with excitement, and told anyone who would listen that Widow Bennet was keeping a wolf behind her cottage. By the following morning, the story had grown considerably in the telling, as stories in small villages always did. What had begun as a single sighting of one curious pup had transformed, through repeated retelling, into a den of dangerous wolves being deliberately raised to threaten the village's livestock, or worse, its children. Clara first learned of the rumor when she visited the village market to sell what remained of her honey stock, and found the usual warm greetings, replaced by wary, sidelong glances. Mrs. Whitfield, who ran the bakery and had always been friendly toward her, offered only a stiff nod before turning quickly back to her own stall. Even the children, who typically flocked to Clara's cart hoping for a small taste of honey, kept their distance, watching her from behind their mother's skirts with wide, curious eyes. It was Harold Pruitt, a farmer known throughout the village for his loud opinions and louder temper, who finally confronted her directly, striding across the market square with his arms crossed and his expression thunderous. "Is it true, then?" he demanded, loud enough that half the market turned to listen. "You are keeping wolves on your property, right here among decent, hard-working folk?" Clara felt her stomach tighten, but she forced herself to meet his gaze steadily, refusing to let her voice waver. "I found 3 abandoned pups during the storm 2 weeks ago," she said. "I have been caring for them. They pose no threat to anyone." "No threat," Harold scoffed, his voice rising further. "Wolves have killed livestock across this entire region for generations. You would bring such creatures right into the heart of our village, and you expect us to simply trust your word that they mean us no harm?" A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd, some nodding in agreement with Harold's concerns, others watching Clara, with expressions caught somewhere between curiosity and doubt. She felt the weight of every eye upon her, and for a moment, the old grief and loneliness she had carried since Edmund's passing threatened to overwhelm the fragile hope she had been nursing over the past 2 weeks. "They are pups," she said, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. "No larger than house cats, and gentler than most dogs I have encountered. I have cared for them exactly as I would care for any orphaned creature, and I have seen nothing in their behavior that suggests danger to anyone." "And what happens," Harold pressed, "when these pups grow into full-sized wolves, as they inevitably will? Will you still speak so confidently of their gentleness then?" Clara did not have a ready answer for that question, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any accusation Harold could have leveled against her. She had allowed herself, over the past 2 weeks, to focus entirely on the present, on feeding and comforting 3 frightened creatures who needed her care. She had not fully considered what would happen, months or years from now, when Birch, Wren, and Ash grew into the same imposing presence she had witnessed in their father that first stormy night. "I do not know," she admitted finally, and the honesty of her answer seemed to surprise the gathered crowd more than any confident denial could have. "But I know what I witnessed that night. I know that a fully grown wolf watched me care for his young, and chose not to harm me, though he easily could have. I do not believe such restraint comes from a creature without some capacity for understanding, for trust. I intend to continue caring for these pups as best I can, and I will accept responsibility for whatever comes of that choice." Harold opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak further, an unfamiliar voice cut through the tension, calm and measured, drawing the crowd's attention toward the edge of the market square. "Perhaps," the voice said, "we might allow Widow Bennet the chance to prove her judgment sound, before condemning her for a decision made in the middle of a storm." Clara turned to find a man she recognized only vaguely, someone she had seen occasionally at the edges of village gatherings, but had never spoken with directly. He was perhaps a few years older than her, with dark hair beginning to show the first hints of gray at the temples, dressed in the simple, practical clothing of a working man, rather than the finer garments of the village's wealthier residents. "And who might you be, to speak so confidently on her behalf?" Harold demanded, clearly displeased at the interruption. "Nathan Cole," the man replied simply. "I keep the mill at the eastern edge of the village. I have no particular stake in this matter beyond a belief that fear rarely makes for wise decisions, and that judgment ought to follow evidence rather than precede it." Harold muttered something under his breath but did not press the argument further, apparently unwilling to continue his confrontation in the face of Nathan's calm, unbothered demeanor. The crowd began to disperse slowly, murmuring among themselves, though Clara could still feel the weight of their suspicion lingering in the air, even as the immediate confrontation ended. She turned to thank Nathan, uncertain what to make of his unexpected intervention, but he had already begun walking away, offering only a brief nod in her direction, before disappearing back into the thinning crowd. Clara stood alone for a long moment amid the half-packed market stalls, honey cart beside her, the taste of Harold's accusations still bitter in her mouth, wondering how much longer she would be able to protect the fragile peace she had built with 3 small, trusting creatures who had no understanding of the growing storm gathering around them. She gathered her remaining goods, loaded them carefully into her cart, and began the familiar journey home, her thoughts a tangled mixture of worry, determination, and a small, unexpected curiosity about the quiet miller who had stepped forward to defend her against a crowd that had already, it seemed, begun to make up its mind. That night, after settling the pups into their nest of clean straw and checking twice that the gap in the barn wall remained properly sealed, Clara sat alone at her kitchen table with a cup of cooling tea and allowed herself, for the first time since the confrontation in the market, to consider seriously what Harold Pruitt had said. He was not entirely wrong. Pups grew into adults. Trust built in innocence did not always survive the tests of maturity, whether in animals or in people. She thought of her own marriage, of the easy affection she and Edmund had shared in their earliest years together, and how that affection had only deepened, rather than faded, as the seasons passed and the harder realities of shared life settled between them. Perhaps, she told herself, trust given honestly in the beginning could grow alongside a creature rather than being outgrown by it. She did not know if the comparison held true for wolves, as it had for her marriage, but it was the only comfort she could offer herself as sleep finally began to claim her, and she resolved to face whatever came next, with the same steady resolve that had carried her through every hardship since Edmund's passing. The days that followed brought a quiet Clara had not expected. No further confrontations came. No angry mobs gathered outside her cottage, but the wariness in the village lingered like smoke after a fire, thinning slowly, but never fully clearing. She continued her honey rounds each morning, nodding politely to neighbors who returned her greetings, with noticeably shorter replies than before, and returned each evening to the small barn, where Birch, Wren, and Ash waited for her with the same unguarded joy that made every difficult moment in the village feel, if only briefly, worth enduring. It was on one such evening, nearly a month after the storm, that Clara first noticed the pups had begun following her not just around the barn, but out into the wider stretch of her property, trotting along behind her with growing confidence as she moved between the garden and the small stream that ran along the eastern edge of her land. She had grown careless, she realized, allowing them more freedom than she had originally intended, but their steady growth and increasing intelligence made confinement feel increasingly cruel, especially when they showed no interest whatsoever in wandering beyond the boundaries of her property. She began taking them with her on short sections of her honey route, at first only along the quiet stretch of road nearest her cottage where few travelers passed, watching carefully for any sign of danger or discovery. The pups trotted alongside the cart with obvious delight, noses lifted to catch the passing scents of the forest, tails wagging in a manner so reminiscent of ordinary dogs that Clara sometimes found herself forgetting entirely what manner of creature she was caring for. It was during one of these short excursions that she first sensed she was being watched. The feeling came upon her gradually, a prickling awareness at the back of her neck that made her glance repeatedly toward the tree line as Daisy pulled the cart along the familiar road. She saw nothing at first, only the usual shifting shadows of leaves in the wind, but the sensation persisted, growing stronger with each passing mile, until finally, rounding a bend where the road curved close to a dense stand of pines, she caught sight of him. The great wolf, unmistakable even at a distance, moving parallel to the road just within the tree line, matching the pace of her cart with an ease that spoke of far greater strength and endurance than her aging horse could ever hope to match. Clara's breath caught in her throat, though the fear that had gripped her that first stormy night was notably absent this time, replaced instead by something closer to relief. He had found them. Or perhaps, she considered, he had never truly lost track of them at all, choosing instead to observe from a careful distance while his pups adjusted to their new circumstances under her care. She did not stop the cart, nor did she call out to him, sensing instinctively that any sudden movement or attention might send him retreating further into the trees. Instead, she simply continued along her route, allowing him the space to follow at whatever distance felt safe to him, while Birch, trotting alongside the cart, lifted his small head suddenly and let out an excited yip in the direction of the tree line, clearly recognizing his father's presence despite the distance between them. The great wolf paused at the sound, remaining still for a long moment among the shadows, before continuing his parallel path alongside the road. Clara found herself smiling, despite the strangeness of the situation, a warmth spreading through her chest at the sight of this powerful, wild creature, choosing, again and again, to remain close to his young, rather than abandoning them entirely to her care. From that day forward, the pattern repeated itself with quiet regularity. Whenever Clara took the pups along her honey route, the great wolf would appear somewhere along the way, shadowing them from within the tree line, never approaching directly, but never straying far either. She began, without quite realizing when the shift occurred, to feel a strange sense of comfort in his presence, as though his silent watchfulness offered a kind of protection she had not known she needed until it was there. The villagers, however, did not share her growing sense of ease. It was inevitable, perhaps, that someone would eventually spot the great wolf trailing her cart, and when Farmer Iris Whitmore reported seeing a massive wolf pacing the tree line along the eastern road one misty morning, the fragile peace Clara had managed to maintain within the village shattered entirely. Word spread quickly, growing more exaggerated with each retelling, until the story circulating through Millbrook Hollow claimed that Widow Bennet had somehow summoned an entire pack of wolves to stalk the village roads, endangering every traveler foolish enough to venture beyond their own doorstep. Clara found herself once again the subject of anxious whispers and pointed stares whenever she visited the market, though this time the hostility carried a sharper edge, tinged with genuine fear rather than mere suspicion. Mothers pulled their children closer as she passed. Shopkeepers who had once greeted her warmly now conducted their business with clipped, minimal words, eager to see her move along. The village elder, a stern, elderly man named Elder Whitfield, summoned her formally to discuss the matter, and Clara found herself standing before him in the small meeting hall at the center of the village, flanked by several concerned villagers, including Harold Pruitt, who wore an expression of grim satisfaction at finally having his earlier warnings validated. The situation has grown beyond what can be dismissed as harmless curiosity, Elder Whitfield said, his voice carrying the weight of long authority. A wild wolf, fully grown, and clearly capable of significant harm, has been seen repeatedly near our roads. Whether or not you intended this outcome, Widow Bennet, your actions have brought genuine danger to our community. The wolf has shown no aggression toward anyone, Clara replied, keeping her voice steady despite the anxious pounding of her heart. He follows only to remain near his pups. He has had ample opportunity to approach the village directly and has chosen not to. Chosen, Harold repeated with obvious skepticism. You speak of a wild animal choosing, as though it possesses the same reason and restraint as any of us gathered here. I have witnessed his restraint firsthand, Clara said, meeting Harold's gaze without flinching. On the night I found his pups, he watched me care for them for hours, without once threatening me, despite every reason he might have had to see me as a danger to his young. I do not claim to fully understand his nature, but I have seen enough to trust that he means no harm to this village. Elder Whitfield studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before finally speaking again. Trust is a fine sentiment, Widow Bennet, but it is not sufficient grounds for risking the safety of this entire community. I am inclined to order that the pups be removed from your care entirely, returned to the wild where they belong, before this situation grows any more perilous than it already has. The words struck Clara like a physical blow. She had known, on some level, that this confrontation was coming, that the growing tension in the village could not continue indefinitely without some form of reckoning. But hearing the elder speak so plainly of separating her from Birch, Wren, and Ash, creatures she had come to love, with a fierceness she had not expected, left her momentarily unable to form any response at all. It was Nathan Cole, standing quietly near the back of the gathered assembly, who spoke next, his calm voice once again cutting through the rising tension. With respect, Elder Whitfield, I would ask that we consider the matter further before reaching such a drastic decision. In the weeks since Widow Bennet began caring for these pups, has any harm actually come to this village? Has livestock been lost? Has any person been threatened or injured? The elder frowned, clearly displeased at having his judgment questioned so directly, but he did not immediately dismiss the point. No harm has yet occurred, he admitted slowly, but the potential for harm grows with each passing week these creatures remain among us. Potential harm exists in many aspects of life we accept, without such drastic measures, Nathan countered. I would suggest a period of continued observation, with clear conditions Widow Bennet must uphold, to ensure the safety of the village, rather than an immediate and permanent separation, that may prove, in time, to have been entirely unnecessary. A murmur passed through the assembled villagers, and Clara held her breath, watching Elder Whitfield's weathered face for any sign of how he might respond to this compromise. After a long, tense silence, he finally nodded, though his expression remained grave. Very well, he said. Widow Bennet, you will be granted a period of continued observation, no longer than 2 months, during which time you must ensure these creatures remain confined to your property, and pose no threat whatsoever to this village or its people. Should any incident occur, however minor, the matter will be settled immediately and permanently in favor of their removal. Do you accept these terms? Clara nodded quickly, relief flooding through her chest, even as the weight of the responsibility settled heavily upon her shoulders. I accept, she said. Thank you, Elder Whitfield. The gathering dispersed slowly afterward, villagers filing out of the meeting hall with expressions ranging from grudging acceptance to open dissatisfaction. Harold Pruitt chief among the latter, muttering darkly to anyone who would listen about the foolishness of granting a wild animal such generous consideration. Clara lingered near the doorway, watching the crowd disperse, until only Nathan Cole remained nearby, adjusting his coat as he prepared to leave. Thank you, she said, approaching him hesitantly, for speaking on my behalf. Twice now, it seems. Nathan offered a small, somewhat reserved smile. I have simply asked that fear not be allowed to make decisions, reason alone should govern. Whether your trust in these creatures proves wise or misguided, remains to be seen, but I did not think it right to condemn you, without at least the chance to prove your judgment sound. Even so, Clara said, I am grateful. He nodded once, seeming almost uncomfortable with her gratitude, and took his leave without further conversation, leaving Clara standing alone in the quiet meeting hall, contemplating the fragile reprieve she had just been granted, and the significant challenge that now lay ahead of her in the 2 months to come. With the elder's conditions weighing heavily on her mind, Clara resolved to prove, beyond any doubt, that her trust in the wolves was not misplaced. She began rising earlier each morning, tending carefully to every detail of her property, to ensure nothing could be construed as neglect or carelessness. The barn's remaining gaps were sealed completely, a proper fence was raised around the perimeter of her garden, and she established a strict routine for the pups that kept them close to the cottage during the hours when villagers were most likely to pass along the nearby road. Despite these precautions, she could not bring herself to fully separate the pups from the world beyond her property, sensing that such isolation would be its own form of cruelty for creatures whose very nature called them toward open spaces and wide horizons. She continued taking them on carefully chosen sections of her honey route, always at times when traffic was lightest, always watching closely for any sign of the great wolf's presence along the tree line. He came without fail, as though some invisible thread connected him permanently to his growing pups. Clara began to recognize the particular rustle of branches that signaled his approach, the way certain birds fell suddenly silent as he passed beneath their perches, the subtle shift in Daisy's posture that told her the great wolf was near, even before she spotted him herself. Over time, her fear of his presence faded almost entirely, replaced by a curious sense of anticipation each time she set out on her rounds, wondering whether today would be the day he finally revealed himself more fully. That day came sooner than she expected, born not from any deliberate choice on her part, but from circumstances beyond her control. She had stopped along a quiet stretch of road to rest Daisy and allow the pups a chance to stretch their legs, sitting on a fallen log, while Birch, Wren, and Ash explored the surrounding underbrush with their usual boundless curiosity. She had brought a small portion of dried meat as a treat, setting pieces down for each pup to enjoy, when she noticed a fourth piece remaining in her hand, unclaimed by any of the three. Without fully considering the wisdom of her action, Clara rose and walked toward the tree line where she knew, instinctively, that the great wolf was watching. She stopped perhaps 10 paces from the edge of the trees, close enough to see the faint outline of his massive form among the shadows, and knelt slowly, placing the piece of meat on a flat stone before her. For you, she said softly, then rose and retreated several steps, giving him space to approach if he chose. For a long moment, nothing happened. The forest remained still, the only sound the distant calling of birds and the soft rustle of wind through the leaves. Then, slowly, the great wolf emerged from the shadows, moving with a careful, deliberate grace that seemed almost incongruous with his considerable size. He approached the stone cautiously, pausing every few steps to study her with those piercing golden eyes, before finally lowering his head to accept the offering she had left for him. Clara held perfectly still, scarcely daring to breathe, as he consumed the meat with quiet efficiency, before lifting his head once more to regard her directly. There was something in his gaze that felt, in that moment, almost like recognition, an acknowledgement of the strange bond that had formed between them since that first stormy night. Then, without any further gesture, he turned and melted back into the shadows of the forest, leaving Clara standing alone on the quiet road, her heart pounding with a mixture of awe and disbelief at what had just transpired. From that day forward, the small ritual repeated itself whenever she paused along her route. A portion of meat left upon the same flat stone, a cautious approach from the tree line, a moment of quiet acknowledgement between woman and wolf before he retreated once more into the safety of the forest. The pups grew accustomed to their father's regular appearances, often bounding toward the tree line themselves to greet him with excited yips and wagging tails, though he remained always cautious around Clara herself, never approaching quite as closely as his offspring did. She began to notice, over the following weeks, subtle changes in his behavior that suggested a growing, if still carefully guarded, trust. He would linger longer near the tree line, sometimes settling into a seated position to watch the pups play, rather than retreating immediately after accepting his offering. On one particularly memorable afternoon, when Wren wandered slightly too far from the safety of the group and let out a startled yip upon encountering a particularly large beetle, it was the great wolf who moved first, crossing the distance between the tree line and the road with startling speed to nudge his frightened pup back toward safety, before retreating once more to his usual watchful position. Clara found herself, during these quiet moments along the honey route, thinking increasingly about the nature of trust itself, how it could be built not through grand gestures or dramatic proof, but through small, repeated acts of consistency and care. She thought of her own marriage, of how the deep trust she had shared with Edmund had grown not from any single moment of declaration, but from years of small kindnesses, patient understanding, and steady presence through both easy and difficult seasons. Perhaps, she reflected, the same principles that govern trust between people applied equally well to the bond forming between herself and this wild, magnificent creature who had chosen, against every instinct that might have counseled otherwise, to allow her into the careful orbit of his family. The villagers, meanwhile, remained largely unaware of these developing rituals, Clara having grown increasingly careful to schedule her honey route excursions during hours when few travelers were likely to witness the great wolf's regular appearances. She knew that revealing the full extent of the bond she had formed with him would likely provoke exactly the kind of fear and hostility that had already nearly cost her the right to keep the pups at all. And so she kept the deepening relationship largely to herself, sharing only the barest details with Old Man Ferris, who continued to visit occasionally and offer his quiet, practical wisdom regarding the pups' care and development. It was Ferris, in fact, who first suggested that Clara consider training the pups more formally, teaching them basic commands and behaviors that might help reassure the village of their manageable nature when the 2-month observation period eventually concluded. Clara took the suggestion seriously, spending long hours each evening working patiently with Birch, Wren, and Ash, teaching them to respond to simple calls, to remain calm around unfamiliar sounds, to display the kind of controlled, gentle behavior that might eventually convince even skeptics like Harold Pruitt that her judgment had not been entirely misguided. The pups proved remarkably quick learners, far more so than Clara had anticipated, responding to her patient guidance with an eagerness that spoke to an intelligence she had not fully appreciated during their earliest days together. Birch, ever bold, mastered new commands almost immediately, delighting in the praise and attention that followed each successful demonstration. Wren, though still occasionally prone to timidity, showed a particular gift for reading Clara's moods and responding with gentle, comforting behavior whenever she sensed her caretaker's stress or worry. And Ash, quiet and watchful as ever, seemed to absorb every lesson through careful observation before demonstrating a level of precision in execution that often surprised even Clara herself. As the weeks passed and the pups continued to grow, both in size and in the sophistication of their behavior, Clara allowed herself, cautiously, to hope that the fragile peace she had constructed might hold long enough to satisfy the elder's conditions. She continued her honey route each day, continued her quiet rituals with the great wolf along the forest road, and continued to feel, with each passing week, that the strange, unexpected family she had gathered around herself since that stormy night at Timber Pass had become something she could no longer imagine living without. Not everyone in Millbrook Hollow shared Old Man Ferris's quiet patience, or Nathan Cole's measured reason. As the weeks of the observation period ticked steadily forward, a small but vocal faction within the village, led always by Harold Pruitt, continued to press for the pups' immediate removal, regardless of the elder's earlier ruling. Harold had lost a lamb to an unknown predator early in the summer, long before Clara had ever encountered the pups in the storm, and though there was no evidence whatsoever connecting that loss to Birch, Wren, Ash, or their father, he had fixed upon the wolves as a convenient target for blame that had, until then, found nowhere else to settle. He began holding small gatherings at the tavern in the evenings, speaking to any farmer willing to listen about the dangers he believed Clara's actions posed to the entire village. His arguments grew more elaborate with each retelling, weaving together half-remembered stories of wolf attacks from decades past, with dark predictions about what might happen once the pups reached their full adult size. Though few villagers fully embraced his most extreme claims, a general unease continued to spread, coloring the way people greeted Clara whenever she passed through the market square or made her deliveries along the village lanes. Clara felt this growing tension acutely, though she did her best not to let it show, continuing her daily routines with the same steady determination that had carried her through every hardship since Edmund's passing. She began to notice, however, small acts of quiet unkindness that suggested the tension was not merely a matter of whispered gossip. One morning she found her garden gate deliberately left open, though she was certain she had closed it securely the night before. Another day, a customer who had purchased honey from her for years suddenly canceled a standing order without explanation, offering only a curt apology when she inquired about the change. The most troubling incident occurred nearly 6 weeks into the observation period, when Clara returned from her honey route to find a crude sign nailed to her garden fence, its painted letters warning that wolves were not welcome among decent folk, and that those who harbored them would answer for whatever harm followed. She stood staring at the sign for a long moment, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air settling over the village, before tearing it down and burning it in her hearth that evening, unwilling to let the pups see even the physical evidence of such hostility. She said nothing of the incident to the elder, or to Ferris, uncertain what good such a report might accomplish beyond further inflaming tensions she was already struggling to manage. Instead, she redoubled her efforts to demonstrate the pup's gentle, well-behaved nature, hoping that consistent proof would eventually outweigh the fear and suspicion that Harold continued to stoke among his fellow villagers. It was during this difficult period that Nathan Cole began appearing more frequently in Clara's daily life, though never in any manner that suggested deliberate pursuit. She would encounter him at the market, exchanging brief but pleasant conversation while she sold her honey. She would pass his mill on her honey route and occasionally catch sight of him working at his water wheel, offering a friendly wave that he always returned with genuine warmth. Slowly, almost without either of them fully acknowledging the shift, these brief encounters began to feel less like coincidence and more like something both of them had quietly begun to anticipate. She learned, through these gradual exchanges, that Nathan had lost his own wife several years earlier, to an illness that had taken her swiftly and without warning, leaving him, like Clara, to navigate the strange, hollow landscape of grief alone. He spoke of his late wife only rarely, and always with a gentle, careful tenderness that suggested a love that had not diminished with time, merely changed shape into something quieter and more private. Clara found herself drawn to this quality in him, recognizing in his careful grief a reflection of her own long journey through loss, and she began to look forward to their brief encounters with a warmth she had not expected to feel again after Edmund's passing. One afternoon in early autumn, as the leaves along her honey route began to turn brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Nathan appeared unexpectedly at her cottage, explaining that he had come to inquire further about the pups after hearing so much conflicting information circulating through the village. Clara, somewhat nervous but genuinely pleased by his visit, led him carefully to the barn, watching his reaction closely as Birch, Wren, and Ash approached him with their usual curious enthusiasm. To her relief and quiet delight, Nathan knelt without hesitation, allowing the pups to sniff and nuzzle at his outstretched hands, with the same patient calm he had shown during his interventions on her behalf at the village meetings. "They seem remarkably gentle," he observed, scratching behind Ash's ears, as the quiet pup leaned contentedly into his touch. "Nothing at all like the dangerous creatures Harold describes at the tavern each evening." "They are simply young," Clara replied, settling onto an overturned crate nearby. "Curious and playful, much like any young creature. I do not deny they will grow into something far more powerful than what you see before you now. But I have seen nothing in their nature that suggests malice or unnecessary aggression." Nathan glanced up at her, his expression thoughtful. "You speak of them with genuine affection, more than simple obligation toward creatures you happen to rescue." "I suppose I do," Clara admitted, surprised by how easily the words came to her in his presence. "I did not expect to feel this way when I first found them shivering beneath that fallen tree. But something changed in me that night, something I am still trying to fully understand. Grief has a way of hollowing out spaces within us," Nathan said quietly, his gaze drifting briefly toward some distant memory before returning to meet hers. "Perhaps these pups found their way into a space that had been empty for far too long." Clara said nothing for a long moment, struck by the simple, honest accuracy of his observation. It was, she realized, exactly what had happened, though she had not yet found the words to describe it so plainly to herself. "And what filled the empty space left by your own loss?" she asked softly, immediately wondering if the question overstepped some unspoken boundary between them. Nathan considered the question carefully before answering. "Work, mostly, for a long while. The mill demands enough attention to keep a man's mind occupied through even the darkest seasons. But lately," he added, glancing toward her with an expression she could not quite decipher, "I have found myself grateful for reasons to step away from the mill more often than I once did." The moment stretched between them, charged with a quiet significance neither seemed quite ready to name directly. It was Wren, ever sensitive to shifts in mood, who broke the silence by clambering suddenly into Nathan's lap, drawing a surprised laugh from him that dissolved whatever tension had been building between them into something lighter and more comfortable. "She has decided you are trustworthy," Clara observed, smiling despite herself. "Wren rarely extends such confidence so quickly to strangers." "Then I shall consider myself honored," Nathan replied, gently scratching the small pup's ears as she settled contentedly against him. The visit stretched longer than either of them had perhaps intended, filled with easy conversation that ranged from the practical challenges of running a mill to shared memories of the spouses they had each lost, the conversation flowing with a comfort that surprised Clara, given how recently she and Nathan had truly begun to know one another. By the time he finally rose to take his leave, the sun had begun its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long golden light through the barn's wooden slats. "Thank you for allowing me to meet them properly," Nathan said as he prepared to depart, "and for trusting me with your reasons for caring for them so deeply." "Thank you for listening without judgment," Clara replied. "It has been in short supply from much of the village lately." Nathan paused at the barn door, glancing back at her with an expression of quiet sincerity. "For what it is worth, I do not believe your judgment has been misguided. Whatever the elder ultimately decides, I hope you know that not everyone in this village has already made up their mind against you." His words stayed with Clara long after he had gone, offering a warmth that lingered through the quiet evening hours as she settled the pups for the night and prepared her own simple supper. She found herself, for the first time in longer than she cared to admit, thinking of someone other than Edmund, with a fondness that felt neither disloyal nor forced, but simply, quietly, real. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, whether from Harold's continued opposition, or from the uncertain future awaiting Birch, Wren, and Ash once they reached their full adult size, Clara found herself facing the coming days with a renewed sense of hope, buoyed by the unexpected kindness of a quiet miller, who had chosen, again and again, to see her clearly, rather than through the distorted lens of fear that had colored so much of the village's response to her unusual family. The attack came on a morning that had begun like any other, cool and clear with the first true chill of autumn settling over Millbrook Hollow. Clara had set out early on her honey route, the 3 pups trotting alongside the cart, as had become their custom, their coats now thick and full, their frames beginning to show the first true hints of the powerful adults they would eventually become. She had grown so accustomed to the rhythm of these mornings, the familiar creak of the cart wheels, the pups' playful darting in and out of the roadside brush, the distant, reassuring awareness of their father's presence somewhere within the tree line, that she had allowed herself, perhaps unwisely, to feel a measure of safety she had not experienced since Edmund's passing. That sense of safety shattered the moment 3 men stepped out onto the road ahead of her, blocking her path with an unmistakable air of deliberate intent. Clara recognized none of them, though their rough, unkempt appearance and the way they carried themselves, alert and calculating, rather than simply curious, told her immediately that these were not travelers seeking directions or fellow merchants hoping to trade. She pulled Daisy to a stop, her heart beginning to pound as the largest of the 3 men, a broad-shouldered figure with a scar cutting across one eyebrow, stepped forward with an unsettling, confident smile. "Well now," he said, his voice carrying a false pleasantness that did nothing to ease the growing dread in Clara's stomach. "A honey cart, traveling alone on such a quiet road. Seems a shame to let such fine goods go to waste on a market that might not appreciate them properly." "I have very little of value," Clara said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage, despite the tremor she felt building in her hands. "Only honey. Enough to make a modest living, nothing more." "Modest living adds up quick enough, over a season," the second man said, moving to flank the cart from the opposite side. "Especially for a woman traveling without a husband to protect her interests." Clara's mind raced, calculating desperately for any option that might extract her safely from the situation, without losing everything she had worked so hard to build. She thought briefly of turning Daisy and attempting to flee, but the men had positioned themselves too effectively, blocking any clear path of retreat, and she knew the aging horse could never outpace 3 determined men on foot across such a short distance. It was Birch who reacted first, some instinct within him, recognizing the threat these strangers posed long before Clara had fully processed the danger herself. He moved between the cart and the nearest man, a low growl building in his chest, his posture shifting into something far more threatening than the playful pup Clara had grown accustomed to seeing each day. Wren and Ash followed his lead almost immediately, flanking their sibling with matching growls, their hackles raised in unmistakable warning. The men paused, clearly caught off guard by the sudden appearance of 3 wolves, where they had expected only an undefended woman and her modest cart. The scarred man's confident smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of genuine uncertainty, as he studied the growling pups more carefully. "Those are wolves," the third man said, his voice betraying the first real note of concern among the group. "What kind of madwoman travels with wolves?" "Wolves that will not hesitate to defend what they consider theirs," Clara said, finding her voice again despite her racing heart, seizing upon the unexpected shift in the men's confidence. "I would advise you reconsider whatever plans brought you to this road today." The scarred man hesitated, clearly weighing the risk of proceeding against the unexpected complication the pups presented, but his greed apparently outweighed his caution, for he took a bold step forward, reaching toward the cart despite the growing intensity of the pups' warning growls. What happened next occurred with such speed that Clara would struggle, in the days that followed, to recall the precise sequence of events. A massive shape burst from the tree line with startling velocity, closing the distance to the road in what felt like a single heartbeat. The great wolf placed himself directly between the startled bandit and the cart, his powerful frame radiating a kind of controlled fury that made even his own pups instinctively yield ground, his low growl carrying a depth and menace that the younger wolves' warnings had entirely lacked. The scarred man stumbled backward, all pretense of confidence gone entirely from his expression, replaced by naked, primal fear, as he found himself facing a fully grown wolf standing between him and his intended prize. His companions had already begun retreating, their earlier bravado dissolving completely in the face of the imposing creature, now guarding the honey cart with such unmistakable resolve. "This is not worth it," the second man said urgently, already backing away toward the tree line on the opposite side of the road. "Let it go." The scarred man seemed inclined to argue, some stubborn pride refusing to accept defeat so easily, but the great wolf took a single, deliberate step forward, his posture leaving no doubt whatsoever about the consequences should the man choose to press his luck further. Whatever calculation occurred behind the bandit's eyes in that moment resolved quickly in favor of self-preservation, and he too began retreating, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender that would have seemed almost comical under different circumstances. "This is not over," he called out as he retreated, though the empty bravado in his voice convinced no one, least of all himself. Within moments, all three men had disappeared into the forest on the opposite side of the road, their hurried footsteps fading quickly into the surrounding silence. Clara sat frozen on the cart's driving seat for a long moment, her hands still gripping the reins with white-knuckled intensity, as the adrenaline of the encounter slowly began to drain from her trembling body. The great wolf remained standing in the road, his attention still fixed on the tree line where the men had fled, his powerful frame tense with readiness should they attempt to return. It was only when he finally turned to look directly at her, his golden eyes meeting hers with an intensity that felt entirely different from their previous careful, distant interactions, that Clara found herself able to speak again. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, though she knew he could not truly understand the words themselves. "You saved me. All of us." The great wolf studied her for a long moment, then moved closer than he had ever ventured before, close enough that Clara could see the individual flecks of amber within his golden eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his powerful frame. He lowered his head slightly, a gesture that felt unmistakably deliberate, before settling onto his haunches directly beside the cart, positioning himself as though standing guard for whatever remained of her journey. Birch, Wren, and Ash, still visibly shaken by the encounter, crowded close around their father, seeking the comfort of his presence after the tension of the confrontation. Clara watched the small family gather together, feeling a complicated swell of emotion rise within her chest, gratitude and relief mingling with a deepening awareness of just how thoroughly her life had become intertwined with these remarkable creatures. "Will you come the rest of the way with us?" she asked softly, though she scarcely dared to hope for an affirmative response. "I would feel far safer with you nearby, at least until I am certain those men have truly gone." To her genuine astonishment, the great wolf rose and fell into step directly beside the cart, walking openly alongside her rather than retreating to his usual concealment within the tree line. Clara guided Daisy forward slowly, scarcely believing the sight beside her, a fully grown wolf walking in plain view along the public road, his three pups trotting close behind, their small family finally, fully united in a manner that would have seemed impossible only hours before. They had not traveled far when they encountered another traveler along the road, a farmer named Elias Whitcomb, returning from an early errand, who stopped dead in his tracks at the sight before him. Clara braced herself for panic, for the kind of fearful reaction that had characterized so much of the village's response to her unusual companions. But Elias, after a long moment of stunned silence, simply nodded slowly, his expression shifting gradually from alarm to something closer to cautious respect. "I heard rumors of bandits working this stretch of road these past weeks," he said carefully, his eyes never leaving the great wolf's imposing form. "Robbed the Hendricks family just last month, I heard, and roughed up old Simmons badly enough that he has not fully recovered his strength since. Seems you had quite the escort to see you safely past them today." Word of the encounter spread through Millbrook Hollow with remarkable speed, though this time the story carried a markedly different tone than the fearful rumors that had circulated in previous weeks. Elias, it seemed, had wasted no time sharing what he had witnessed, and by the time Clara reached the village market later that same afternoon, she found herself greeted, not with wary suspicion, but with a curious mixture of astonishment and grudging admiration. Even Harold Pruitt, when he finally confronted her again near his usual spot at the tavern, seemed noticeably less certain of his previous convictions. "I heard you were set upon by bandits along the eastern road," he said gruffly, his tone lacking its usual sharp edge, "and that the wolves drove them off before any harm came to you." "That is exactly what happened," Clara confirmed, watching him carefully for any sign of his familiar hostility. Harold was silent for a long moment, clearly wrestling with some internal conflict between his long-held convictions and the undeniable evidence of the wolves' protective loyalty. "I suppose," he said finally, with obvious reluctance, "that a creature capable of protecting, rather than merely threatening, deserves some reconsideration of judgment previously formed against it." It was not a full apology, nor a complete reversal of his earlier opposition, but it was, Clara recognized, a significant shift from the man who had so vehemently demanded the pup's removal, only weeks earlier. She thanked him simply, without pressing the matter further, sensing that pride alone would prevent him from conceding any more ground than he already had, and turned her attention instead toward completing her interrupted honey route. Her small, remarkable family gathered close around her, their bond now forged through danger, as much as through the quiet trust that had brought them together in the first place. It was not until that evening, once Clara had finally returned home and settled into the familiar quiet of her cottage, that she noticed the great wolf favoring his left foreleg, a subtle limp that had gone unnoticed amid the chaos and relief of the earlier confrontation. She had not seen him sustain any visible injury during the encounter itself, but as she watched him settle carefully onto the ground near her barn, clearly reluctant to leave the pups so soon after the day's events, she caught sight of a shallow gash along his leg, likely earned during whatever brief, tense moment had passed between him and the fleeing bandits before she had fully registered the danger. She approached him slowly, mindful of the boundary he had always maintained between them despite the growing trust they had built over the preceding months. "You are hurt," she said softly, kneeling a careful distance away. "Will you allow me to help you?" The great wolf regarded her steadily, and for a long moment Clara believed he might retreat, might reject this closer intimacy, even after everything they had shared. But instead, he remained still, watching her with an expression that seemed, remarkably, to convey a kind of weary permission, as though the events of the day had finally worn away whatever final reservations had kept him at a careful distance for so long. Clara moved with deliberate slowness, retrieving clean cloth and a small amount of warm water from her cottage, speaking in a low, steady voice as she approached him again, much as she had done that very first night beneath the fallen tree at Timber Pass. "I am simply going to clean the wound," she explained, though she understood he could not grasp her words directly, trusting instead that her tone and manner would communicate the gentleness of her intentions. "It will not take long, and I promise to be as careful as I can manage." He flinched slightly as she first touched the cloth to the wound, a low sound rumbling briefly in his chest, but he did not pull away, did not show his teeth or offer any true resistance, simply enduring her careful ministrations with a patience that spoke volumes about the trust he had, against all odds, come to place in her. Clara worked methodically, cleaning the wound thoroughly, before wrapping it gently with a strip of clean cloth, all the while continuing her quiet, steady murmur of reassurance, much as she might have spoken to a frightened child or a nervous animal in her care. "There," she said finally, sitting back slightly to survey her work. "That should help it heal properly, so long as you allow it time to rest." The great wolf studied his bandaged leg for a moment, then lifted his head to look at her directly, his golden eyes holding hers with an intensity that felt different from anything that had passed between them before. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned forward and pressed his great head briefly against her shoulder, a gesture so unexpected and so clearly affectionate that Clara felt tears spring unbidden to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, reaching up carefully to rest her hand against the thick fur of his neck. "For everything. For trusting me with your pups, for protecting me today, for allowing me close enough now to return even this small kindness." Birch, Wren, and Ash, who had been watching the entire exchange with evident curiosity, chose that moment to bound forward and insert themselves enthusiastically into the tender scene, climbing over their father's legs and nuzzling against Clara's hands, apparently determined not to be excluded from whatever warmth was being shared. Clara laughed despite the lingering emotion of the moment, gathering the pups close as their father watched with what could only be described as quiet contentment. It was Nathan who arrived unexpectedly a short while later, having heard the news of the bandit encounter from villagers still buzzing with the story, and who found Clara sitting in the fading evening light, surrounded by her small, remarkable family, the great wolf, resting peacefully nearby, with his freshly bandaged leg. He paused at the edge of her property, clearly hesitant to interrupt such an intimate scene, but Clara noticed him immediately and beckoned him closer with a warm smile. "I heard what happened," Nathan said, approaching carefully, his eyes moving with evident respect between Clara and the great wolf resting nearby. "Are you truly unharmed?" "Thanks entirely to this remarkable family," Clara said, gesturing toward the pups and their father. "I do not know what might have happened had they not intervened when they did." Nathan knelt slowly beside her, offering the great wolf a respectful nod that seemed to acknowledge, in its own quiet way, the debt of gratitude he felt on Clara's behalf. The wolf studied him for a long moment, then, to Clara's genuine surprise, allowed Nathan to remain close without any sign of the wariness he had shown toward other unfamiliar humans in the past. He trusts easily, it seems, once trust has been properly earned, Nathan observed, watching as Ren clambered happily into his lap once again, apparently having decided some time ago that he belonged among her small circle of trusted companions. Trust earned through patience, mostly, Clara replied, and through consistency. He has watched me care for his pups for months now, has seen that my intentions never wavered, despite everything the village threw against us. I believe today simply confirmed what he had already begun to understand. They sat together for a long while as the evening deepened around them, the pups eventually settling into drowsy contentment against their combined warmth, the great wolf resting nearby with his bandaged leg tucked carefully beneath him. Clara found herself acutely aware of Nathan's presence beside her, of the easy comfort that had grown between them over the preceding weeks, of the way this strange, unexpected family she had gathered around herself seemed, increasingly, to include him as naturally as it included the wolves themselves. "I have been thinking," Nathan said finally, his voice carrying a note of careful deliberation that drew Clara's full attention, "about how remarkable it is, the way loss can sometimes lead us toward exactly what we did not know we needed. I lost my wife, and grief nearly hollowed me out entirely, before I found my way back toward some semblance of purpose through the mill. You lost your husband, and grief led you, eventually, to a stormy night on Timber Pass that changed everything about the life you thought you would live. And what has this particular loss led you toward now?" Clara asked softly, though some part of her already suspected the answer he was building toward. Nathan turned to look at her directly, his expression open and unguarded in a way she had not seen from him before. "Toward you, I think. Toward this strange, remarkable family you have built from nothing but courage and compassion. I did not expect, when my wife passed, that I would ever again feel drawn toward another person with such genuine warmth. But these past months, watching you fight so fiercely for these creatures, watching your judgment prove sound again and again despite every obstacle the village placed before you, I have found myself hoping, more than I perhaps should admit so plainly, that there might be room in this remarkable family for me as well." Clara felt her breath catch, the weight of his words settling over her with a warmth that reached far deeper than mere surprise. She had felt the growing connection between them for weeks now, had allowed herself small moments of hope regarding what it might mean, but hearing him speak so directly, so honestly, about his feelings, made the possibility suddenly, thrillingly real. "I would like that very much," she said softly, reaching out to take his hand in the fading evening light, while beside them, the great wolf lifted his head briefly, to observe the exchange, before settling back down, with what Clara chose to interpret, in that tender moment, as quiet approval. The weeks that followed brought a quiet happiness into Clara's life that she had not expected to feel again after Edmund's passing. Nathan visited regularly now, no longer under any pretense of concern about the pup's well-being, but simply because he wished to spend time with her, and with the small, remarkable family that had come to feel, increasingly, like something he too belonged within. He brought small gifts on occasion, fresh bread from the bakery, a length of ribbon he thought might amuse the pups, once even a small carved wooden wolf that he had whittled himself during quiet evenings at the mill, presenting it to her with an endearing shyness that made her laugh with genuine delight. The village, too, had shifted considerably in its perception of Clara and her unusual family. The story of the bandit encounter had spread widely enough that even the most stubborn skeptics found it difficult to maintain their earlier fears in the face of such clear evidence of the wolves' protective loyalty. Elder Whitfield, when the 2-month observation period finally concluded, called Clara before the village assembly once more, though this time the atmosphere carried none of the tension that had characterized their previous meeting. "It seems," the elder said, addressing the gathered villagers with a note of grudging acknowledgement, "that Widow Bennet's judgment has proven sound where many of us doubted it. The wolves have brought no harm to this village, and have, by every account I have gathered, actively protected one of our own from genuine danger. I see no further grounds for continuing the restrictions we placed upon her these past months." A murmur of general agreement passed through the assembly, and even Harold Pruitt, seated near the back with his arms crossed, offered only a resigned shrug rather than any further objection. Clara felt a profound relief wash over her, The culmination of months of careful effort finally rewarded, with the acceptance she had hoped for, but had not dared to fully expect. It was against this backdrop of settling peace, both within the village and within her own heart, that Nathan came to her one crisp autumn evening, with a request that would prove far more complicated than the simple happiness their growing relationship had otherwise brought her. "Clara," he began, his tone carrying an unusual seriousness that immediately drew her full attention. "I have thought long and carefully about what I am about to say, and I hope you will hear me fully before responding." She nodded, settling onto the bench outside her cottage, the pups, now nearly grown and impressively large, resting nearby in the golden evening light. "Of course," she said. "What is it?" Nathan took a slow breath before continuing. "I love you, Clara. I have not felt such certainty about anything since my wife's passing, and I do not wish to waste any more time dancing carefully around feelings we both, I believe, already understand clearly. I would like to marry you, if you will have me." Joy surged through Clara so completely that for a moment she could not find any words at all, simply reaching for his hands, with tears gathering unbidden in her eyes. "Yes," she managed finally. "Yes, Nathan, I will marry you." His answering smile carried such genuine relief and happiness that Clara felt the last lingering shadows of her long grief finally begin to lift entirely, replaced by a warmth and hope she had thought, for 2 long years, she might never fully feel again. But even as she basked in the joy of his proposal, Nathan's expression shifted, a flicker of hesitation crossing his features that gave her sudden pause. "There is one matter, however, that I feel I must raise honestly, before we proceed any further," he said carefully. "My mill sits at the eastern edge of the village, closer to the main roads and the more populated areas than your own cottage. I worry, Clara, about how the wolves might be received there, particularly as they continue to grow. I worry about the safety of any children we might have together one day, about the ongoing concerns of neighbors who may never fully release their fear no matter how much evidence contradicts it. I do not ask this lightly, knowing how deeply you care for them, but I must ask whether you have considered a life where the wolves might need to return, finally, to the wild they came from." The question struck Clara with unexpected force, the joy of moments before suddenly complicated by a conflict she had not anticipated having to face so directly. She looked toward Birch, Wren, and Ash, now grown into creatures of genuine size and strength, no longer the small, trembling pups she had found shivering beneath a fallen tree, but still, in every way that mattered to her, the family she had built with her own hands and her own steadfast care. "I understand your concerns," she said slowly, choosing her words with careful deliberation, "and I do not dismiss them lightly. But I cannot simply abandon creatures I have raised as my own, not after everything we have endured together, not after everything they have given me in return. I need time to consider what this means, Nathan, for both of us." Nathan nodded, his expression understanding despite the visible disappointment he could not fully conceal. "Take whatever time you need," he said gently. "I do not wish to force a choice between the life we might build together and the family you have already built with such courage and love. I only wish for us to find a way forward that honors both." Clara spent the following days wrestling with a decision that felt, at times, impossible to resolve. She loved Nathan, genuinely and deeply, and could envision a future with him, filled with the same quiet contentment and partnership she had once shared with Edmund. But she loved Birch, Wren, and Ash with an equal, if different, ferocity, and the thought of severing the bond they had built together, of returning them to a wild that no longer felt entirely natural to creatures who had grown up trusting human companionship, felt like a betrayal she could not easily reconcile. It was during one of these long, contemplative evenings, sitting alone near the barn while the pups slept peacefully nearby, that she found herself, unexpectedly, in conversation with the great wolf, who had taken to visiting more openly since the bandit encounter had cemented his trust in her intentions. "I do not know what to do," she confessed aloud, though she knew he could not truly understand her words. "I love Nathan. I want the future he offers me, but I cannot imagine a life that requires leaving your children behind, not after everything we have shared together." The great wolf studied her for a long moment, his golden eyes holding a depth of understanding that made Clara wonder, not for the first time, whether some deeper comprehension truly did exist behind his patient, watchful gaze. Then, slowly, He rose and moved to stand beside her, resting his great head briefly against her shoulder, in the same gesture of affection he had offered once before, following his injury. It was in that quiet moment, surrounded by the peaceful stillness of her small property, that Clara found the clarity she had been searching for. She did not need to choose between two separate futures, she realized. The solution lay not in abandoning one family for another, but in finding a way to bring both together into a single, unified life. The following morning, she sought out Nathan at his mill, finding him at work among the familiar creak and groan of the water wheel, and shared with him the idea that had crystallized within her overnight. "What if," she proposed carefully, "we did not choose between the mill and the wolves, but instead built a life that made room for both? Your mill sits at the eastern edge of the village, but you own considerable land beyond it as well, do you not? Land that borders the same forest where I first found the pups?" Nathan's expression shifted slowly from uncertainty to genuine consideration as she continued outlining her proposal. A life built at the edge of both worlds, close enough to the village for the practical realities of their livelihoods, close enough to the forest, for birch, wren, and ash, to roam with the freedom their nature required, while still remaining close to the family that had raised them. "It could work," Nathan said finally, a smile beginning to spread across his features. "It would require some adjustment, certainly, and continued patience from our neighbors, but I believe, given everything we have already overcome together, that this is a challenge we could face successfully." Relief and joy flooded through Clara in equal measure. The impossible choice she had feared suddenly transformed into a path forward that honored every part of the life she had built since that fateful stormy night at Timber Pass. She embraced Nathan warmly, feeling, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that every piece of her fractured, rebuilding life had finally found its proper place. The wedding was set for the first clear day of early winter, when the last golden leaves still clung stubbornly to the trees, and the air carried the crisp, clean scent of the coming season. Millbrook Hollow had transformed considerably in its attitude over the preceding months. The wary suspicion that had once greeted Clara, replaced almost entirely by warm anticipation for the celebration that would unite the widow honey merchant and the quiet miller who had so steadfastly defended her judgment from the very beginning. Clara had spent weeks preparing for this day, though not in the manner most brides might occupy themselves with such preparations. Beyond the simple matters of her dress and the modest feast the village had generously offered to help provide, she had focused her attention primarily on a different kind of preparation entirely, one that involved patient hours spent with birch, wren, and ash, and, increasingly, with their father as well. The idea had come to her almost by accident, during one of the quiet evenings when Nathan had visited to help with final wedding arrangements. Watching the pups, now nearly full-grown, and possessed of a natural grace that made them genuinely magnificent creatures, an idea had taken root that felt, the moment she considered it, entirely right for the occasion that awaited them. What if, she had suggested to Nathan, the wolves were part of the ceremony itself, rather than simply present at its edges? They have been such an integral part of everything that brought us together. It seems fitting that they should share in the celebration as well, not merely as spectators, but as participants. Nathan had agreed readily, delighted by the idea, and together they had spent the following weeks working patiently with birch, wren, and ash to prepare them for the unusual role Clara envisioned. The pups took to the training with their characteristic enthusiasm, and even their father, after some initial hesitation, had allowed himself to be gradually included in the careful preparations, his growing trust in both Clara and Nathan finally extending to accepting a role in the celebration that would unite their small, remarkable family formally with the village that had once feared them so deeply. On the morning of the wedding, Clara rose before dawn, her heart alive with a mixture of joyful anticipation and gentle, bittersweet remembrance of the path that had led her to this day. She thought briefly of Edmund, of the honey cart he had left behind, of the storm that had broken its wheel on Timber Pass and set into motion everything that followed. She hoped, as she dressed carefully in the soft morning light, that he would have understood, and perhaps even approved, of the unexpected turns her life had taken since his passing. The old honey cart, the very same vessel that had carried her through 2 years of quiet grief and, eventually, into an encounter that changed everything, had been transformed for the occasion. Village craftsmen, moved by the remarkable story that had unfolded over the preceding months, had volunteered their skills to refurbish it entirely, replacing worn wood with fresh, polished panels, adorning its sides with ribbons and late autumn flowers, until it bore little resemblance to the humble merchant's cart it had once been. Clara arrived at the small clearing near the chapel, where the ceremony would take place, to find the entire village, already gathered, filling the space with a warmth and welcome that would have seemed impossible only months before. She caught sight of Elder Whitfield, near the front of the assembly, his expression carrying genuine warmth, rather than the guarded caution of their earlier meetings. She saw Old Man Ferris, beaming with obvious pride, and even Harold Pruitt, standing somewhat awkwardly near the back, but present nonetheless, a quiet acknowledgement of how thoroughly his earlier convictions had been transformed by everything that had unfolded. And there, waiting beside the beautifully restored honey cart, stood Birch, Wren, and Ash, each adorned with simple ribbons woven carefully into their thick coats, their powerful frames radiating a calm dignity that drew gasps of admiration, rather than the fear such a sight might once have provoked. Beside them, standing with quiet, watchful patience, was their father, the great wolf whose careful trust, earned across so many months of consistent kindness, had made this entire remarkable day possible. Clara felt tears gathering as she approached the cart, reaching out to rest her hand gently against the great wolf's head, a gesture that had become so natural between them that she scarcely noticed anymore how remarkable it truly was. "Thank you," she whispered, "for trusting me enough, all those months ago, to allow this life to unfold exactly as it has." The ceremony itself passed in a warm blur of joy, Nathan's steady, loving presence beside her throughout every moment, the gathered village watching with genuine happiness, rather than the wary suspicion that had once colored every interaction Clara had experienced within Millbrook Hollow. When at last the officiant pronounced them married, a cheer rose from the assembled crowd that seemed to shake loose the last remnants of fear and doubt that had ever clouded the village's perception of the family Clara had built. It was time, then, for the procession that would carry the newly married couple back through the village, toward the modest celebration awaiting them, and it was here that the true purpose of the months of patient training finally revealed itself in full. Clara and Nathan climbed together onto the beautifully restored honey cart, now transformed entirely into a wedding carriage worthy of the remarkable love story it carried. Birch, Wren, and Ash took their positions alongside the cart, walking with proud, dignified grace, rather than their usual playful bounding, while their father, in a gesture that drew a collective gasp of wonder from the watching crowd, stepped forward and settled himself directly at the front of the cart, in the very position where Daisy would traditionally have been harnessed, though no harness bound him there, only the deep, unshakable trust that had grown between himself and the woman who had once knelt in the mud of Timber Pass to offer honey to his frightened, shivering pups. He did not pull the cart in any literal sense, for Daisy remained harnessed properly to do the actual work of drawing the carriage forward, but he walked directly alongside her, his powerful presence at the front of the procession creating an image so striking, so utterly unexpected, that the entire village fell into a hushed, reverent silence as the wedding carriage began its slow procession through the heart of Millbrook Hollow. Clara looked out at the faces lining the village lane as they passed, faces that had once regarded her with fear and suspicion, now transformed into expressions of genuine wonder and admiration. She saw children reaching out timidly to wave at the passing wolves, no longer held back in fear by their mothers, but encouraged forward with gentle curiosity. She saw Harold Pruitt, of all people, offering a respectful nod as the procession passed his position, an acknowledgement that carried more weight than any words might have conveyed. Beside her, Nathan reached for her hand, his expression carrying the same quiet wonder that seemed to have settled over the entire gathered crowd. "I do not believe," he said softly, "that any wedding procession in the history of this village has ever looked quite like this one." "No," Clara agreed, laughing with pure, unguarded joy as Wren trotted alongside the cart with obvious delight, her ribbon fluttering in the crisp autumn breeze. "I do not suppose it has." As the procession wound its way through the final stretch of the village lane, Clara found her thoughts drifting back once more to that stormy night at Timber Pass, to the broken wheel, and the shivering pups, and the massive, watchful presence that had, against every instinct that might have counseled otherwise, chosen trust over fear. She thought of Edmund, and of the honey cart he had left behind, now transformed so completely into something neither of them could ever have imagined. She thought of Nathan, and the quiet, steady love he had offered her through every challenge the preceding months had brought. And she thought, most of all, of Birch, Wren, and Ash, and their father, the remarkable family born from a storm that had once seemed like nothing more than misfortune, but had ultimately given her back everything she had feared lost forever. The wedding carriage rolled onward through the golden afternoon light, Honeycart transformed into a symbol of the most unlikely, most beautiful family imaginable, while the great alpha wolf walked steadily at its front, leading the woman who had first shown him kindness, and the man who had chosen to love her fully, family and all, toward whatever remarkable future still awaited them all together. Behind them, the village of Millbrook Hollow watched in quiet, reverent wonder, forever changed by the story that had unfolded within its borders. A story that proved, beyond any doubt, that the most unexpected bonds often prove the strongest, and that even the fiercest hearts, wild or human alike, can be won through nothing more than patience, kindness, and an unwavering willingness to trust.